Hi, my name is Dave Esposito. In 2001, I donated a portion of my liver to my brother-in-law, who was terminally ill at the time with liver disease. Since then, both he and I are doing well and are living healthy, productive lives. Last year in this country, over 16,000 people needed liver transplants, and less than half of those people got liver transplants. And sadly, about 1,400 people died as a result of not being able to get a donated organ. I wanted this film to educate and encourage those of you watching who have a friend or family member with terminal liver disease to think about the information presented in this story and to consider becoming a living donor. Although there's a lot of knowledge you need to know and understand, and there are risks involved in living donation, I can tell you firsthand that if you decide to donate, you will have done a great thing, a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Our family wants to thank the transplant surgeons, nurses, social workers, and support staff who have dedicated their lives in a very profound way to helping one person give to another.
When Sungray was getting close to the end, I really didn't think I was ever going to be happy again. And this gift from my brother was
it's hard to even talk about because I didn't want to even live then. My name is Sungray Son. I'm 61 years old and I live in Suffolk, New York. I teach at Sarah Lawrence College. I'm a violinist. I guess it's about 13, 14 years ago. I suddenly lost lots of weight. So I went to Dana-Farber Medical Center and the head of the cancer unit said, no, I don't have cancer at the moment and I should see somebody else. So again, I went to another doctor and he found that I had Hep B,
which apparently he had since childhood. It really came, I guess he was having an acute episode. At this point he was very sick, very weak.
He was supposed to die in 6 months. He had liver cancer. It was all over. I just remember at that time it was very uncertain as to what was really wrong with Sungray.
Sungray went through a battery of tests and it was determined that he was going to need a liver transplant, that his liver was failing rapidly enough that he was going to have to face this.
Sungray had cirrhosis of the liver as the result of having had infection with the hepatitis B virus for many years. He had gotten this way back long ago. It's the nature of the liver to be able to handle injury very well, and so that it takes many years for a process of the damage to the liver that ultimately leads to a transplant to develop. But over time, the repeated injury and the liver's attempts to recover from the injury lead to the buildup of scar tissue in the liver, which ultimately reaches a point where it's called cirrhosis. And at that point, a number of different things start to happen, and they started to happen to Sungray.
Everything was going badly. My memory was going, and it was always very cold. And I couldn't sleep for days in an end. And I had cramps in my body. I couldn't move. And so it was real torture.
Pressure starts to build up in the blood vessels, in the spleen, in the stomach, the intestine, and in the esophagus, the channel that brings the food down to the stomach, because the blood can't pass through the liver very well. Pressure starts to build up, the veins start to enlarge, and they can lead to, and did in Sungray's case, lead to repeated episodes of rupture, bursting of these blood vessels, leading to episodes of internal bleeding, any one of which can be fatal, and they're certainly scary and debilitating. Ultimately, the only solution is to replace the liver.
And so he was put on a waiting list. He had several more hospitalizations at Mount Sinai when he became acutely ill, and we really didn't know whether he was going to get a liver. There were people far sicker than he, and it was explained to us that the liver would go to the sickest patient. My state of mind was awful because it was always dealing with the unknown. It was always dealing with, is he going to have a bleed? And we were kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Well, we had been hearing bad news about Sungre's health, and every time we talked with Pat, it was going from bad to worse, and we were very concerned. And just by blind luck, I happened to read an article in the New York Times about liver donation, live donation, and we were just astonished. We had never heard of this before. We didn't know if it might be possible, but we just decided we should talk about it and see if it might work for Sungre.
When I heard Ann tell me about that article in the New York Times, I basically made up my mind right then to try to become a live donor. It didn't seem to me that Sungre was going to make it. I think if he would have died before he had gotten a cadaveric organ. And this just seemed like the perfect way for him to get a transplant while he was still strong enough to hopefully pull through the operation. I remember at the time being surprised that Pat and Sungre didn't seem to want to talk about live organ donation with myself and Ann, or whether they didn't know very much about it. They just didn't seem very communicative about it, and I wasn't sure what was going on.
We were so focused on a cadaver providing a liver in time for Sungre that we didn't even consider the possibility of a living donor. It wasn't mentioned to us.
I didn't even know about the living donor situation. I didn't know somebody actually can give. I thought I'll be dead.
So I wound up giving the transplant center at Mount Sinai Hospital a call, and I wound up going in for an interview with a social worker who gave me an orientation to becoming a live donor for Sungre. And I do remember she also asked in a number of different ways whether I was feeling any coercion or pressure from family members, and I said, really no, just the opposite. I was pressuring to become a live donor. I wanted the process to move forward as quickly as possible.
Back in 2001, when Dave and Sungre went through the living donor process, things were very different. Currently, there are a lot of state and federal regulations around living donation, and most of these have been put in place to protect the donor. Now every transplant program has a team approach to living donation, and so recipients are educated about the need for transplant, and living donation is presented as an option to them in most cases.
Yes, my name is Emmanuel Malik, and I'm interested in becoming an organ donor. I have a family member who is sick, and I'd really like to help out, if I may.
If there is somebody who wants to be a living donor in the family, or a friend who's interested in doing that, they call the transplant program and they have a separate evaluation by a separate team. And this team would consist of a physician, a surgeon, a nurse who's a transplant coordinator, a social worker, and a living donor advocate. And this person's sole job is to make sure that the donor understands the risks involved and that there's no coercion that exists, and really helps them to make the decision.
Many transplant candidates are hesitant to talk about the possibility of living donation with their family members. They feel like they don't want to burden their family members or their loved ones with such a difficult decision, or they're thinking about the well-being of their loved ones and wouldn't want to put them in harm's way. It's also important for transplant candidates to keep in mind that their loved one may be waiting for an opportunity like this, as in living donation, and they might be upset, the loved ones, if they're not given this opportunity to help in this way, to learn about the option.
As I learned later, Pat and Sungre were having some of these concerns themselves.
We started to feel very awkward around David. Does he really want to do this? What about his wife? How do we even talk about these things?
I knew it must be difficult for Pat and Sungre to consider having a family member as a donor. But, there just seemed no question in my mind that as long as I was a suitable donor physically, that this was obviously the way to go. The chances were good for both of us. Now I think about it, I think, well, sure, I wanted it to happen, but Sungre could have turned down me as a donor. He could have just not wanted to risk a family member. And I've told him in subsequent years, if he had done that, I would have probably murdered him myself. I don't think I've ever had a physical as thorough as the one I had at Mount Sinai in order to become a living donor. I had x-rays, an MRI. I visited a blood doctor, also a cardiologist, and a psychologist and a social worker, all of this in one long day.
In general, the screening process for living donation, the living donor evaluation, it's a very extensive process and entails a big group of healthcare providers to evaluate the donor from every single aspect, from a medical aspect, a surgical aspect, and also psychological and psychosocial aspect in order to be a living donor.
A living donor needs to be a healthy person with a healthy liver, specifically cannot have any defined liver disease. Ideally should be not much smaller than the recipient, and in some cases where the donor is significantly bigger, it even gives us the advantage of being able to use the left lobe rather than the right lobe of the liver, which makes the procedure safer since the left lobe is 35% and the donor is that much farther away from trouble. The blood type has to be compatible, not necessarily identical. For example, O is a universal donor, so that if the donor is type O, it doesn't matter what type the recipient is, the donor can give. Apart from the medical aspects, it's important that there be a connection between the donor and the recipient. In the United States, at least, it's illegal to sell organs, and the donor has to have a legitimate reason for wanting the recipient to remain alive and well.
Not long after my screening, I was given the okay to become Sunray's donor, and then they basically told me the next move was up to me as far as scheduling the transplant. And I wanted to do it soon, the sooner the better, and the idea being that Sunray would be able to be operated on while he still was fairly strong, and everyone else seemed to feel that was a good idea too, so we pushed for sooner rather than later.
David was given a date in December, and suddenly there we were.
The sense of time going into the week of the transplant was really, everything accelerated. It was like a train just going down the track inevitably, and it was looming larger than life.
I think we were all focused on the new beginning, you know, what was about to happen. In less than 24 hours, Sunray would have had his operation, and hopefully we'd both be doing well, and it would be like a new life.
I was just walking around in fog, I guess. And then when we actually walk into the surgical place, then I realized, you know, it's going to happen. And then I was out.
The day of the surgery, it's essentially what we say, it's a full day event for everybody. For the donor, for the recipient, for the donor team, and for the recipient team.
We can't look at a liver and say, well, we need about this much. We have to divide the liver at the point between the left and the right lobe so that each side has its complete blood supply. We are obviously doing these two procedures at the same time in adjacent rooms in order to minimize the time that the donor piece of liver will spend out of the body. So we'll be consulting back and forth, you know, are you ready yet? No, give us a half an hour, so we'll take a little break until the recipient room is ready. When everything looks perfect and all bleeding is stopped and things are controlled, we close up there.
And next time I woke up, I felt suddenly, really, I can think suddenly, and I was warm for the first time in many years. So just dramatic change that I felt, and I didn't have a lot of pain, and my body seemed like it's my own again.
I remember waking up and feeling pretty done in. I remember laying on the bed, and I couldn't turn the room right side up. Everything was sideways. I also remember the first few days I couldn't sleep real well, and I would go to sleep and I think it was morning and maybe 2 minutes had gone by. And so it was some long nights. The first week was pretty tough, yeah.
When a donor has an operation, they're usually in the operating room for about 4 or 6 hours. And after that, they spend some time in the intensive care unit, usually overnight, and then are hospitalized for about 5 to 7 days. They go home and they don't feel all that great. And usually they're back to work about 6 weeks after donation, but they don't feel 100% for about 3 or 4 months.
I was 48 at the time of the transplant, and within 6 weeks I was back to work. Within 3 months I was bicycling 15 miles a day to and from work. Like most transplant donors, I've had really zero long-lasting after effects from the transplant from having been a donor. Sunray's had a few health issues though, like many transplant recipients, and he continues to have a few.
Even now, it's 9 years later, if I do something weird with my body, I still feel the pain, but that's just minor thing you carry. And you realize, I guess it's a reminder that you did have transplant.
Over the last few years, I really hadn't given the transplant all that much thought. It seemed like days and weeks and even months would go by without much of a thought about it. But it was just an amazing experience. To have Sunray be okay, to have my sister not have to be a widow 10 years ago, I feel really good about that. And of course, I feel really good that medical science was there to take us through this.
This gift from my brother was, it was a gift of life for me, as much as to Sunray, because here he is and he's relatively well. He's had some complications, but he works, he functions, he's a violinist, he gives concerts, he's doing everything he wants to do, even gardens and swims. So, can't argue with success.
If it hadn't worked, then it would have been completely different. If it hadn't worked, either Dave or Sunray might have been gone, or both. And so I think the impact is that they're both still here. They're both still here, and we get to have more time together.
Living everyday life as just normal everyday life, it's not like that anymore. So it's a very different way of looking at life itself, after the transplant.
At this point, as opposed to maybe when I was younger and more of a surgical cowboy type, if you want to say, I feel a little bit of trepidation every time we start a case like this, and I'm thankful each time that things go well.
If I hadn't been able to donate to Sunray, my older brother Joe was ready to step in. And to me, in a perfect world, there'd be a line forming for each and every person needing help.